Discuss PTBOA. Does the PTBOA have the authority to overrule the auditor when it comes to exemptions? We have denied a limited amount of taxpayers for exemptions because we felt that they did not meet the proper criteria for the exemption, only for them to go to the assessor, appeal to the PTBOA, and the board then routinely rules in their favor.
Yes, thank you for bringing it up. So sometimes the auditor will be involved in the appeal process in front of the PTBOA, specifically with deductions or exemptions, primarily more the deductions versus the exemptions, but it could be both. But yes, if the auditor says, hey, this person didn't get their homestead filed, or we're denying the homestead, and the taxpayer files an appeal saying, hey, I think I'm entitled to the homestead, the auditor then would have responsibility to go before the PTBOA and say, here's why we denied this homestead deduction. And if the PTBOA said, hey, we agree with the taxpayer in that situation, they could overrule the decision by the auditor to deny that deduction. The taxpayer, if the taxpayer was denied by the PTBOA, the taxpayer could appeal to the Indiana Board of Tax Review, in which case the auditor then would be brought in or party to that IBTR hearing. So yes, it is possible for the PTBOA to overrule a decision by the auditor in regard to a deduction.
The second question, is the Form 103-ERA confidential, or can the assessor share it with the auditor?
Gesundheit over there. The 103 ERA form is confidential. There are certain things that in the ERA that relate to earnings, to salaries, that type of thing, but each case is individual or specific, and if you had a question in terms of what is or what is not confidential, Luke Britt, who is the state's public access counselor, could provide a legal opinion if you reached out to his office to say, hey, is this information disclosable? Is it public information or is it confidential? He could provide a formal legal opinion, but generally speaking, the ERA form is confidential.
Okay. I have a question about appeals. First, a comment. Appeals can cause added work for us in the auditor's office because every time there's a successful appeal, we're the ones who have to make the adjustment and then issue the new tax bill. And we've seen some issues with appeals as they affect properties in TIF districts because that can affect the increment. So my question is, does the DLGF track the nature of appeals in terms of number per county and the depth, the breadth of the appeals, the amount? And if so, where can we get that statistical information?
Yes, we do track it, but it's done by the assessor and it's on Gateway. If you look at Gateway under, I forget which tab it is, but it's the reports tab. But it shows the prior year and it shows a lot of information in terms of the number of appeals filed, how many were resolved in favor of the taxpayer, how many resolved in favor of the assessor. Are there any outstanding appeals at the local level? Are there any appeals outstanding at the IBTR level? So that information is available on our website, but it is submitted by the county assessor. So if you had questions, specific questions about where those appeals were filed, were they in specific TIF districts or parts of town or areas, you're better off reaching out to your county assessor to try and get a better handle on it. Most assessors through their CAMA software will have a appeal tracking system that you could look at. I do know the legislature we've been working with the legislature. They've been trying to get a better handle on appeals, and so I think going forward there may be a further emphasis on appeal activity in greater detail. So,
Barry, it's Patty Ball from Davis County. I just would like for you to speak briefly. I kind of know the answer to this a little bit, but we've been hearing rumblings from about the personal property and legislation, and also in regards to the legislation matter for another legislative matter, and it just escaped me right now because I was talking about the first one. But I know the assessors are very active legislatively on some of the concerns and rumblings that you're hearing. Would you speak to that for the auditor's sake?
Sure. So there's been, if you look at the General Assembly and what's been going on, there tends to be shifts and changes from year to year, and this may be over, say, a 10-year period of time. That sometimes I go back to when the state passed the tax caps, the circuit breakers. There was a push towards residential taxpayers saying, hey, we need help, we need a break. And so the legislature passed, and then the voters in the state of Indiana changed the Constitution to implement the circuit breaker. Well, that pendulum swung back, and all of a sudden the business community is saying, hey, we need some help here. We're losing jobs to competing states. Other states are eliminating personal property, and so the pendulum swung back now sort of towards the business community. I'm not saying it right or wrong. It's just here's how it happens. You go back and forth, and so we start out with personal property. And for those of you that have been around like me for a long time, we used to assess inventory and tax inventory. And the business community said, hey, we're losing jobs to Michigan, Ohio, whomever, because we're taxing inventory. The state General Assembly said, okay, we'll eliminate the assessment of and taxation of inventory. Then they start saying, well, we want to look at trying to get more businesses coming in, so we have an exemption for personal property of $20,000. And a couple of years later, that's changed to $40,000. And now, this past session, the General Assembly changes it to be $80,000 starting next January 1st. There's been talk of, hey, why don't we just get rid of personal property altogether? Make it very business friendly. The only problem with that, and we work closely with the AIC, is some counties, some jurisdictions are very dependent upon personal property. And what happens if you eliminate a big chunk of your revenue from the assessment and taxation of personal property? Who's going to make up that difference? Do you have an increase on residential taxpayers? Do you have an increase in your local income tax? So there is that shift towards getting rid of personal property, but until there's a viable solution, it may happen in my lifetime, it may not, I don't know. So I don't know if that answers your question or addresses the situation, but there certainly has been a ebb and flow, a shift and change, and there may be that pendulum swinging back that people say, hey, why are the businesses getting this huge tax break? Let's swing it back towards residential taxpayers. So, yes, sir.
I have a question concerning appeals. We have a situation where there was multiple appeals in multiple years on a piece of property. Then it went to tax sale in 2018. So appeal was not filed in 2018. So and it's been tied up in court actually on whether or not it was a valid sale or not. We just did get a recent ruling that it was a valid sale. So since an appeal was not filed in 18, would the tax sale buyer, which those previous years would be wiped off, would that tax sale buyer be eligible for any of those previous year appeals since there wasn't one filed in 18 and should have took deed to it in 19?
Good question. And
I got to follow up too.
We do next. Remember, you need to call.
Okay, good question. My initial reaction would be no, but this is something where, because it's specific to this taxpayer, specific to the situation, I would suggest contacting your county attorney to help walk through the process. But it's one of those things where if I'm the buyer of the tax sale, I'd want to say, hey, I want to get in on this, but somebody could make the case that, hey, you weren't the owner, why should you get this? We see the same situation sometimes when a person sells their house and they have an appeal pending, who gets the benefit? That's something that the two parties are going to have to reach an agreement on in the sale process. But I would suggest contacting your county attorney since it is very detailed, specific to that situation. So I'm about ready to get the hook off the stage. Right out of time. please, like I said, if you do have any questions specifically like that, please, here's my contact information. Please reach out. Email is typically the best way to get a hold of me, but you know, I know in some counties situations, the county assessor and the county auditor, it's sort of like the Hatfields and the McCoys. In other cases, everybody gets along great and plays well in the sandbox, but end of the day, we're all in it for the same reason, the same purpose, to make sure that taxpayers are assessed and taxed fairly and equitably in a timely manner. So it's a team effort. So thank you very much, everybody.